And today we are celebrating the feast of St. Luke, who was a dear friend of the Apostle Paul, mentioned by him 3 times in his letters. And Paul describes him as the beloved physician, and in the second letter to Timothy, and he's his only companion in prison. He's believed to have been the author of 2 books in the New Testament, firstly the Gospel, which stands in his name, and also the Acts of the Apostles. Luke's narrative of the life of Christ has a pictorial quality, and it shows the sequential pattern from the Nativity through to the death and resurrection. The developed sense of theology that comes over in Paul's writings is virtually unknown in those of Luke, but as a Gentile, Luke makes clear the good news is for salvation for everybody, regardless of gender, or social position, or nationality. And so today we think about everything that we have learned and been inspired by through the work of St. Luke. St. Luke. Now, St. Luke, interesting character. We've already heard in the introduction that he was a companion of St. Paul. And it's said in the introduction that the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles are attributed to Luke. I think it's actually better to think of the author of the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles as really the editor rather than the author, if you see what I mean. Because it's quite clear that the person who put together the Gospel has access to other sources. For instance, he has access to Mark's Gospel. And it's quite clear that Mark's Gospel keeps on cropping up, direct quotations throughout the Gospel of Luke. Also, there are other quotes, if you like, that come from what scholars call either the sayings of Jesus or Q. And I've always asked people, what does Q stand for? And I never got an answer. So there you are. But anyway, there was some sayings of Jesus that were doing the rounds, and they appear. And so what happens is that whoever the editor is brings these things together with other things as well. Lots of people make contributions to the Gospel, and they're all brought together. And like all editors, they can be then blended in such a way that they give a message. And Luke's message is very clear. He doesn't have access to Matthew, by the way. Matthew was written afterwards. Luke's Gospel ends up at about the end of the 1st century, probably between 80 and 90. And what happens is that he takes all these different things, blends them all together to give a message for people to hear. Now, Matthew's Gospel is clearly designed to be easily digestible by the Jewish community. Luke's Gospel, on the other hand, is far broader than that. People who were brought up in a classical Roman education of the time would find that they could digest it easily. Or people who were brought up in the Greek traditions of education time would find that they could digest it easily. Incidentally, the Jewish community would also be able to digest it. But what is coming through is the idea that Luke sees the message of Jesus as being available to absolutely everybody. It's not restricted to the Jewish community. It is there for everyone. That's not surprising, because if he is the companion of St. Paul, that is exactly what St. Paul was doing. He was taking Jesus' message out to the Gentile community. Now, for us, probably, we would express it in a slightly different way. And so what I'm going to suggest is that in Luke, what we find is a global version of Christianity. And that's why constantly throughout the whole Gospel, you will find that Luke majors on social justice and inclusion. Because he can see that the message of Jesus, if it were really truly adopted globally, could actually make a massive difference to the whole of society and the whole of civilization. And so he can see that the basic foundations of every successful society, every successful civilization, will always be about social justice and inclusion. Very sadly, it didn't quite work. I don't mean that what Jesus' message didn't quite work, but I mean we didn't respond to Jesus' message at a global level in the way that clearly Luke hoped. And there were two very good reasons for that, and they're all built into every single human being. And sometimes, sadly, they get built into a society. One of them is greed. Every single person actually suffers from this terrible thing called greed. However much we like to pretend it's not true, it is. I mean, when we go to have coffee in a few minutes, you will all look at the plates, and I won't go any further. All right? It's just a human condition. The trouble is, this human condition can cause the most dreadful things. In the world, people are greedy for money. They're greedy for power. They're greedy for status. And that can do all sorts of terrible, terrible things, especially as people get more money and get more power and get more status. The greed doesn't ease at that point, it just gets worse. And the whole of history is pockmarked with people whose humanity was distorted because of greed. And then there's another thing that all of us suffer from, even though we try not to. We really, really do try not to, and that's prejudice. It's so easy to slip into a moment of prejudice. You see something on television, and instead of listening seriously to what is being said, we bring our prejudices to the moment, and we only listen to certain parts of the words that are being said because we want them to reinforce what we brought in our prejudice in the beginning. And that's what lies behind so many of the issues that divide people, divide families, divide communities, even divide nations. Greed and prejudice. The very opposite of the things that Luke is inspired by in the message of Jesus. Luke can see that the only possible way in which we can enjoy a truly, truly beneficial society and a civilization about which we can be proud is if it is based on social justice and on inclusion. Very sadly, at the moment, we can see the consequences of the fact that that isn't what has happened to us globally. So Luke sees this as a global, wonderful vision where everybody hears the message of Christ and everybody lives by the message of Christ and everybody reaches out to one another with justice and mercy and compassion and inclusion. And I think he'd be so disappointed if he looked and saw what's happening at the moment. Our televisions at the moment are full of something which, quite frankly, is hurting. Are you hurting? I am. I can't help but hurt. I hear all of these things about families and what's happened to those families. You can put yourself in their position and you can say to yourself, my God, I couldn't cope with that. I'd be so worried about my children. I'd be so worried about my husband or my wife, or I would be so worried about what's just about to happen. And that's the consequence of us not hearing the message of Christ. If only we could hear the message of Christ and live by it and respond to it and include everybody and build a world around social justice, then the consequences of that is not only peace, it's a special kind of peace. It's a peace that feels full of love. It's a peace that feels full of hope. It's a peace that passes beyond understanding. Now, in the gospel today, Jesus sends out people to do that work, to take his message out into the world. And that didn't stop with those disciples. It's my responsibility. It's your responsibility. And if we fail in that, then we fail in everything. So let's prayerfully today, inspired by St. Luke, inspired by the message of Jesus, start today to work for social justice, for inclusion, and the peace of God that passes all understanding.